Hello, everyone. Welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Martina Schleiper. I work with Matthias Drösler in the Peatlands Science Center as a research assistant. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all today to a talk given by Dr. Dave O'Leary. And Dave has asked me not to do a very in-depth introduction because he has some slides to tell you about himself later on. So I'll just do some quick housekeeping before we get going. As you may have seen, we are recording this talk and we will put it online for the students in full length. For everyone else, we will make Dave's talk publicly available, not the discussion part. So please, during the talk, keep your mics and cameras switched off if you don't want to be seen. But during the discussion part, feel free to switch on your camera and mic if you want to ask your question in person. I think that's it for technical housekeeping. Ella, in case I forgot something, please chip in. And yeah, other than that, Dave has just asked me to maybe very briefly mention the large advantages of early career researcher networks, because this talk is mainly geared towards the students of the Climate Change Management Master's program. And yeah, just for networking purposes, if you have a research area you're really interested in, go out and see if there's an early career researcher network out there. That's how Dave and I met. And it's a really great opportunity to meet people who work in your research area, who are more up and coming, not so established, who are maybe easier to talk to and not quite so intimidating as going up to a professor at a big conference. And with that, I will hand over to Dave. Thanks so much, Dave.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Everything's still working?
Yeah, perfectly.
Cool. And yeah, no, about the introduction mainly is because I just wanted to add a few slides into the start of my talk to who is this guy and why is he here giving a talk today. So yeah, my name's Dave O'Leary, as Martina said. I've only just recently finished my PhD from a university here in Ireland. And today I'm going to be talking about what you can see on the screen, the mapping the peatlands of Ireland, understanding spatial variation using remote sensing and machine learning. It was sort of topics that came up during my PhD and formed a couple of papers that we got out during it. So I thought that would be nice for today, focusing on some of the machine learning and remote sensing aspects of that. So first of all, where am I? I suppose is a nice one. I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with Ireland. So, you know, we're quite a small landmass on the very edge of Europe, known for our, having a pint in the pub and some nice landscapes, and only about 60 or 70,000 square kilometers of landmass, speaking English and our own language, Irish and stuff. And where I live and where I am right now is just over here on the west coast of Ireland in a town called Galway. So just introducing a bit of where we stand geographically. My career so far, so sort of how I came to be here where I am now today. So I did my undergraduate from the university here in Galway. It was then called the National University of Ireland, in a degree called Earth and Ocean Sciences. So kind of a jack of all trades, I suppose, is the best way of describing it, covering everything from geology, hydrology, geophysics, and oceanography. I then decided, upon doing my undergrad thesis, to go and pursue a master's in the University of Leeds. The thesis for my undergrad was about using geophysics to find cavities, caves in some of the karst geology in the south of Galway, or in the middle of Ireland. And so geophysics held my interest, and that's what I went on to study in Leeds as well, where I did a master's in exploration geophysics, which was quite industry focused. And because of that master's, I was lucky enough to get a job in industry as well in a company called Schlumberger. Schlumberger is an oil and gas exploration company. So we were the contractors who were going out doing seismic surveys to help oil and gas companies decide where to position their wells and how to best extract oil and gas from the subsurface. I said I give a little bit of background on that sort of side of things as well. As a geophysicist, it meant I got to work offshore. That's really what I'm trying to get at here. I was on the forefront of exploration, I suppose. We'd be living and working on these ships for a couple of weeks at a time and then traveling home. And the sort of science that we were doing, or the surveys that we were doing, were called ocean bottom cable surveys, where we'd lay receivers on the sea floor and listen for the echoes coming back off when we set off air guns in the water column. And that way you can sort of build, almost like an MRI, build a subsurface, 3D subsurface picture, so you can decide where best to drill. But really, you know, when you go work offshore, the best part for me was always the extra stuff. So we got to like go to dry docks and drive boats and fly in helicopters and all that fun stuff. So as a young graduate coming out of a master's degree, this was something that was interesting to me. I got to travel all over the world and have lots of time off, as well as learning all the fun science and industry side of things. So then in 2018, I said I decided to come back to Galway, back to Ireland, and pursue a research career. I got in contact with my old supervisor for my undergraduate degree and asked them about opportunities to do a PhD and what sort of areas were of interest in Ireland at the time where my skills could be applicable. And I got very lucky in that I got funding for a 4-year PhD in using geophysics, and the sort of geophysics I'll talk about in this over the course of the next half an hour or so. Looking at more environmental issues, though. Now, originally, it was actually nothing to do with peatlands, but when COVID hit in and we were all stuck at home, we had to refocus the PhD a little bit, and we were able to focus on a problem that is now, you know, sort of known throughout Europe and the world of peatlands and what to do with them and how do we manage them and look after them going forward. I was lucky to finish my PhD almost on time earlier this year, and I've now got a research position as a postdoc in one of our agencies, a government agency in Ireland called Teagaisc. It's an Irish word, but it's basically the agency that looks after food and agriculture in Ireland. But part of the agricultural sphere in Ireland is on peatlands, so it's still quite relative to the work of my PhD. Now, of course, very little research is done in isolation, so I just wanted to talk very briefly about the team that I work with. So this is a research group that I work with, set up by my supervisor. Eve is the lady on the top right, called the HiRES, which is the Hydrogeophysics and Remote Earth Sensing Research Group. It's quite new, and we're still sort of figuring out exactly, you know, where we're working. But the basic mission statement is we're trying to link this near-surface geophysics, which is the methods I'll talk about today, and remote sensing technologies for sustainable water and catchment management at multiple spatial scales. And that's sort of what geophysics is used for. It's to try and tie things together spatially. And we use lots of different methods, as our diagram on the right. So what we're talking about today, really, and I want to give a background on sort of what peatlands are in Ireland. And some of you may know this already, or some of you may not, but peatlands are effectively very high organic soils. That's as a simple way of putting it. And we have lots and lots of peat in Ireland. The map in the middle is sort of the current best peatland map of the country. You can see from 2009, and it's very simply broken down into 4 different classifications of peat, which is non-peat or mineral soils, raised bogs, which I'll explain, and then low and high level blanket bogs. So in the Irish context, and I guess across much of Europe, the situation was quite similar. Blanket bogs, which are described on the left-hand side of the screen, are sort of high level. They're in uplands. They were formed after the clearing, or in the last couple of thousand years, they were formed after the clearing of trees for farming and cultivation. And then because they were clear and they were exposed, they started to build up, vegetation would build up and start dying on it and effectively form bogs, these blanket bogs. And then people started to move into them and drain them and start cutting them for fuel. And then on the right-hand side, we have these raised bogs, which are more leftover depressions after the glaciers moved out, that were filled with water and became separated hydrologically from the groundwater, perhaps, and then became stagnant, and material started to build up in these lakes, eventually forming these raised domes. The geographic spread across Ireland, so the Midlands is mostly the raised bogs, and then any sort of highlands and to the west are the more blanket bogs. And that's just the general distribution of them across the country. What they sort of look like now, so these are blanket bogs, so they're so named because they blanket the landscape. They're quite wet, they're quite inaccessible, often quite wild and difficult to get to, but there are still people who live in these areas, and they have been used for extraction of turf, which is what we call the peaty material that's removed and put into little briquettes that can be burnt from these landscapes. And then the raised bogs of the Midlands, so these are much sort of large geographic areas. You can sort of see the scale bar on the top left diagram. So these are just like brown scars. That's what they're sort of known as now across the landscape. They would have been raised bogs originally, but a lot of agencies and a lot of other industries went in and have been removing peat from these sites for many years for burning to create electricity, for horticulture, for domestic heating, for lots of different things in Ireland. And the reason for all of these things really, and this is why I wanted to bring some of the history of the peatlands in Ireland along today as well. So these are excerpts, or just I've taken them from actually from a Facebook page from our national peatland agency in Ireland, and these are the adverts that were put out to people, encouraging them to go out into these bogs and into these lands and remove some of the soil, because there was money in it. Quite simple. As you can see there, if you're not able to read the middle one, or if you can't see it, sorry, the middle one is turf means money. Surplus turf will mean extra money for you. Cut as much as you can, double or if possible treble the quantity you require for own use, and there's a ready market. And on the right hand side, it's quite small, but it says, "Do you realize what organized cutting of turf has done for this country in the last 3 years?" In the time of horrors of a fuel famine and some conditions that exist in many European countries, industries would have stopped and hardship and things. So basically, just these ads were encouraging people to go out and cut turf for burning and for selling. This was at a time sort of post World War II, so it was a means of keeping the country, going in a time of economic hardship. And this is the more modern advertisements and sort of messages that are being given out and told to people. So, we have conferences going on. There was conference in Canada earlier this year, and in Antwerp. Big power to the people. Big conferences, international conferences, bringing scientists together to see what's the next stage and what's next to do with these peatlands. There's also these sort of articles like the one in the middle, thousands of hectares of drained farmlands to be targeted for rewetting. And, it's the sort of stuff that makes farmers in Ireland anyway quite nervous about what's going on and what sort of rules and laws are coming down. And on the left-hand side is just a graph from a paper that came out earlier this year as well, which just shows the sort of level of peatland loss, or wetland loss, it says actually, since 1700. And it's just interesting to see the countries that are the greatest, I suppose, the ones that have removed the most peatlands are the ones who also probably benefited economically from them. So I just wanted to include all this just to show that there's a history to these peatlands, and it's not, there's lots of different reasons as to why people may or may not have removed them at different times during the history. Like arguably Ireland and some other countries in Europe may not have been as prosperous as they are now without those peatlands. But of course, that still means we still need to look after them now from their current state and bring them into the future. So what I am, and I've alluded to it already, is I'm a geophysicist. And what that means is that we go out, and as much as we'd like it to be like the situation on the left, where we can sort of magically see under the ground and tell you everything about it, what we actually do, of course, is go out with some complicated equipment, and we spend days in the field, and we might use complicated physics and maths to try and build an image of the subsurface. And even that image is only a representation. It's not actually what's down there. It's some sort of proxy, which we then have to convert and turn into some interpretation of the subsurface. So just to give a little sort of brief view of what it is to be a geophysicist in cartoon form. So, and really what geophysics does is it bridges that gap between the scales. So, a lot of people might be familiar with soil sampling and taking analysis back to the lab and getting properties that way. But often then, in terms of spatial coverage, one of the best, or one of the only ways to do it really, is with geophysics, unless you can go out and sample very, very rigorously and very, very densely. Another way of doing that is to go out and collect these non-invasive geophysical surveys, where you can cover lots of ground quite quickly, and then maybe tie it back to some less samples that you may have taken from the lab. And really, the scales that I'm working at or try and think about are anywhere between the field and large scale. So that's what we're looking at, somewhere between plant, crop, and landscape scales. And also in our research group, we're trying to move away from this sort of single survey type. We'll move into repeat experiments where we go back and collect data again and again and look at temporal changes. And really, where my area is, and what I'm going to be talking a bit more about today, is this data fusion, assimilation, and the analytics and machine learnings. And one of my sort of objectives of the thesis, and one of the outcomes and aims, was to be as objective as possible. So to remove my own biases and my own sort of inherent thinking from the process, and let the data do all the talking. So that's what I'm going to try and show you, or that's what I'm going to show you what I tried to achieve today during the thesis. So some of the different methods that geophysicists use. So we have these things called electrical methods. So this is where we send an electric current down into the ground, and we can measure the resistance between two electrode points. And from that, we can sort of build an image, like on the left, where you have these points in the ground, and you can build like a triangle of data, a 2D profile, it's called, of the electrical conductivity. And electrical conductivity can tell us lots of things, like it can be linked to, say, porosity of the soils. It can be linked to the pore water content, so what type of water is actually in it, salinity, clay content, soil texture, lots of different things it can be linked to. And this is just one of the methods we can use. And on the right-hand side, it's something called electromagnetic induction. So this is where we send an alternating magnetic field into the ground and induce a current in the conductive subsurface, which is then, it creates its own secondary magnetic field, which can be recorded at the receiver. And this is a very useful instrument because even though they're recording very similar properties, the one on the right you can walk around with. And I think I have an example here of it actually working. So these are the different instruments. On the left is that electrical resistivity, and on the right is the EM measurement. So you can just see how you can cover quite a lot of ground. This is from a survey that we did with some of our undergraduate students a year or two ago. And you can just see how you can cover lots and lots of ground and build up these maps using geophysical measurements. So moving up a level now, so we've talked about those are sort of ground-based methods for capturing in a field area, but we also have airborne geophysical surveys. In Ireland, we're very lucky. Our geological survey has acquired an airborne survey covering most of the country, as you can see there in the middle. And the bottom left is the individual blocks that were recorded over various years. So this survey is called Teil. It's acquired data every 200 meters at an angle of 345 degrees consistently across the whole country, recording 3 different geophysical data sets. So it's an incredibly powerful thing to have available, and all this data is freely available to anyone as well. So it's very, very useful and like I said, powerful thing to have across the whole country in terms of building up a sort of a data classification or a way of like looking into the subsurface across the whole country. And tied to that is a geochemical soil survey as well, where they're attempting to take a soil sample at various depths every 4 kilometers squared across the whole country as well. So really quite a powerful data set. I'm going to talk a bit more about radiometrics later on. So that's the one that I focus on mainly. But the airborne EM is very similar to what we just talked about, the electromagnetic method. And then magnetics is looking more at the geology and used as geological classification. So it's looking at the geomagnetic differences across the country. And then the final scale, so we're moving up again into the satellites. So satellites are incredible data sources as well. The European Space Agency runs the Copernicus program, which provides free, globally free satellite data for like anywhere in the country at a very high spatial and high temporal resolution. There's a return time of sometimes 6 or maybe 7 or 8 days where the satellite passes over the same area. Broadly speaking, they acquire 2 different types of satellite data, broken up by the electromagnetic spectrum on the right-hand side. So the optical satellite data are Sentinel-2. That's energy that's come from the sun, been reflected off the surface of the Earth, and then bounced back up to the satellite. And it covers everything from sort of the ultraviolet, visible, and infrared bands from the sun. And then the S1 or SAR or radar satellite data, that is an active source where the satellite produces a ping. It produces a microwave that travels down and then reflects back off the surface of the Earth and is recorded by the satellite again. And the differences in phase and amplitude can tell you something about the subsurface or the very near surface as well. So again, this is just another data set that is available to remote sensors and geophysicists and can be used in these data fusion and data analytical techniques, in this case for peatlands, but for lots of different other applications as well. So this is where we're getting more into the stuff that was related to my PhD. And I said I'd show a result first. So this map on the right is actually something that's just been produced. It's something we're going to be publishing in the next couple of months, and it'll be made available to as a public database as well. And it's just taking back the title to mapping of peatlands in Ireland and understanding the spatial variation. But really the 3 things I wanted to say and sort of keep in mind over the next couple of slides are that basically all maps are wrong. You need to understand the data that went into creating such a map. And you also always want to think about how maps are validated. And I come at this from a point of view of I had to look through the master's program that you guys have, and there's some GIS and stuff like that as well. But it seems like it's more, you're going to be going out as climate change masters people and maybe going into policy or decision making and all this. And maps are, there's lots of maps everywhere. So if you can keep some of these mapping ideas in mind when they're being used for decisions, I think it's a very important concept to understand just exactly how they were created and how they're validated. So on the first point that all maps are wrong, I suppose that's not really wrong is a very bold statement. All maps are different, and all maps map things in a different way. And these are just 4 maps that are available for free in Ireland, again, different databases, and they all have peatlands as one of their polygons or one of their descriptors. So the Quaternary sediments map, which is the one on the left, this is it's a map produced by our geological survey. It was created using traditional methods. And by that, I mean, it's people going out into the field, taking samples, using compasses and GPS and taking points and measurements, and then going back to the office and lab and drawing stuff on maps and making boundaries and all that. The Irish soils map, which is the next one along, the middle one on the left, that was created as a soil map of Ireland by Teagasc, actually, by the people I work for now, and our EPA. And it was done using more machine learning techniques. So it took like environmental covariance, the soil forming factors, old soil legacy databases and maps that would have been created, when the state was founded, and then turned them into a national map as well. The Corine 2018 map, that's a satellite product. So that was created using the satellite optical data. It's produced by the European Space Agency for all of Europe, and it's basically a land cover map. So it covers, it's what's on the very near surface. And then this DIPM, that's that's the map I showed earlier on of the different peatlands, the variation across the country. And it's an academic output. It's produced by combining the Irish soils and the Corine map together. And really what I wanted to show here is just that they're all different. Each of them are mapping something slightly different, and each of them end up then with different, say, peatland areas in this case, significantly different in some places. So it's just to highlight that every map you look at has different scales and different resolutions. And, you have to know what you're looking at and understand what each of them means in order to use it for any particular task. So we're going to delve now into a little bit more of the methods of like the data that goes into creating the map that I made specifically. So what I'm interested in is something called radiometrics or gamma ray spectrometry, which may be a more familiar term. And this is effectively the emission of a gamma ray from an unstable isotope that's present in the soil or in the earth. Now, these isotopes and all these materials stuff, they come from way back from when the solar system was created and the sun had a disk of material around it, of particles, and they all coalesced to form a planet. And some of these particles were radioactive, some of the elements were radioactive. And when the Earth was formed, and since the Earth was formed, it's been giving out, a little bit of radiation all the time. In Ireland, in particular, there's sometimes an issue with something called radon gas, which is a byproduct or a daughter element of uranium. So uranium in the Earth has turned into this gas and seeps into people's basements, and it can be carcinogenic. So it's a bit of an issue here. But just as an example of where you might have heard of some of this stuff before. How we capture radiometric data is that little diagram on the bottom right. So a gamma ray enters into a crystal and effectively lets off a burst of light. And that light then gets bumped up and amplified and then gets turned into a voltage and a current in order to get like a count, so a hit, and the energy level of the particle that came in. That's the basic premise of recording the data. How it works in practice. So an airplane flies over the Earth, and the Earth is constantly emitting this radiation. And as the airplane flies over, it's able to record different energy levels, you can consider like a spectrum of visible light. So there's an energy spectrum of radioactivity that's been given off. And once it's all processed, the contractor or the processor provides a thorium, uranium, and a potassium counts, and then a total count for the full energy spectrum. And this is one of the data sets. That's the TELUS data set that I talked about earlier that's been acquired across the whole country. It has a footprint of about 180 meter circle. So quite a large footprint on the ground because it's just gamma rays that are traveling at the speed of light, just coming up to the airplane. So it's very hard to focus that down to a single point, but it's quite a large footprint, but it's very usable data still. Why is it important for peatlands? Well, peat is, as I mentioned earlier, it's a very organic material, which means it doesn't have much minerals. It doesn't have much geological content. It's made up of dead plants. That means that it's not a source of radioactivity. It's mostly water and material and dead plants. And so it acts as a way of attenuating the signal. It actually blocks the gamma rays. You may have heard in nuclear reactors, they put water in to sometimes slow down the reaction. It's not a dissimilar concept here. Another part of it is that the non-peat soils or mineral soils are made up of bits of material, bits of clay and sand and everything else. And that acts as a source because the bedrocks and the sediments is the underlying source. But of course, parent material is derived from bedrock. And so it acts as an additional source. So basically, what that means is you have high radiometric signal where there's no peat and quite low radiometric signal where there is peat. And then another sort of step on from that is even if you have changes within the peat, maybe you can identify peat from non-peat, but when you have changes in the peat itself, in the data covered over a peatland, then maybe that indicates changes in the type of peat that's there as well. So this is why radiometric data can maybe be used for mapping of peatlands. So I'll just bring it back to the radiometric survey again. So the actual, I didn't say this earlier, but the map in the middle is the total count data. So it's the full energy spectrum counts per second for the telesurvey flying over the country, all merged together. And maybe you can even see already that the areas of low and blue, to sort of visually line up with some of the peatland maps I've shown you before. So even as a broad indicator of peatlands, you can maybe see that this is already doing a good job. You can see that it was acquired in different blocks, which are these areas down here. So for my PhD, I just focused on one single block to try and get the theory working. And that's what I'm just going to show you over the next few slides. So the traditional approach to geophysics and to handling geophysical data is that you'd acquire some data, you'd process it in some way, shape, or form. You'd have to put it into some type of modeling, forward modeling or inversion, it's called, tying it into borehole data and maybe previous work that's been published. Convert that into some petrophysical model, and then that comes out with sort of a layered earth or some sort of physical property that you're looking for. And it's a complicated approach, but more importantly, from the point of view of my thesis, when I was thinking about this, it's quite subjective. There's a lot of user expertise that goes into this sort of a process. And the diagram on the right is just one such example of converting some geophysical data into some physical property. But as I said, it's quite subjective. It takes a lot of expert user knowledge and maybe a priori knowledge and different things to go into this to make it into an answer. And to my mind, sometimes anyway, that can lead to biases in maybe the results. So the focus and the approach I wanted to take during my PhD was to be as objective as possible, and remove myself from the equation where possible. So what I turned to is machine learning and neural networks, which are big, fancy, complicated terms, but it's basically just a way of relating different data types to the answers that you may already have. So this is a schematic of it. You take some data that you require, you have some answers, or in this case, some known subsurface type. You format all the data together and you put that through some machine learning algorithm. And then you get this trained neural network, and you can then take that neural network and put it through, or put new data through it, and then it will classify that into whatever it is you're looking for. So with all that in mind, that was my research question for the first paper was, we have lots of uncertainty for peatlands in Ireland due to the modification of land. Can radiometric data discriminate between these peat and non-peat soils? So basically a simple question is, can radiometrics break the country or break the landscape into peat and non-peat, binary 1, 0, or 1 or 2, peat or non-peat? And, luckily, or I guess the answer was yes, we could. So we took some data from that single block on the west coast of Ireland, where I am now, and we took the quaternary geology map, because even though I did say it was wrong in places, it's also right in lots of places. So we took the parts that we knew were right, and we were able to train a neural network, which agreed with us, as in it was able to predict the peat or non-peat soils with 95% predictability. And we were then able to apply that network to the rest of the block and produce the map on the right-hand side, which is the new peatland map based on the radiometric data. Looking at it back from this scale, it's kind of hard to see how useful it is, but if we zoom into a particular area, so this is just one of those raised bogs in the Midlands. It's right at the edge of the survey, so that's why it's sort of cut off on the top left-hand side. But if we look at the aerial image, that's just the outline of the bog, it's an old industrial bog that has been mined over the past couple of decades and is now pretty much almost down to no peat, but there's still about a meter of peat left. So the quaternary geology, that's QGM, is the quaternary geology map. So that's the outline of peat there that we talked about before. The Irish soils map is the next one, the Coreen, the land cover map, and then the DIPM, which is the derived Irish peatland map, and then my TELUS peat map here. So, one of the advantages of using radiometric data or geophysical data is it's a measure of the subsurface. It is passed through the earth and arrived at the aeroplane, whereas the other methods are either, the traditional methods are maybe missing boundaries because they're only able to take certain points, or maybe they don't have access to certain parts of the land because it's private. The Coreen is a land cover map, so it can only see what's on the surface. So if something appears as a forest, it doesn't appear as peatland. And then the DIPM is sort of a combination of different things. So it is also flawed in that way a little bit. And in terms of the peatland area, you can see that, 4,224 hectares of peat mapped out by this radiometric method, which maps closely to some of the other databases, but the distribution is different. And another important part of the radiometrics is the fact that it can pass through land cover types. So areas that were previously mapped as maybe forestry or as grass are now appearing as peatlands. And that's becoming more and more relevant in the current climate, in the current situation where farmers are being asked to re-wet peat soils. These peat soils have been previously drained and been used for grazing or other agricultural practices, and now becoming identified as potential sources of carbon that have been missed, and maybe areas where we can do better at storing carbon or at least stopping it being released. So that's that part. Another thing that can be done with this, and this isn't rigorous by any standard, is just something I put together for talks like this, is a colleague of mine in Galway has gone out and actually measured the emissions at various land cover types in Ireland. And that then they can be used for something called tier 2 emissions, which is where it's a more, so basically tier 1 emissions are what are out there. If you don't know what type of soil you have, you can say, right, grasslands emit X amount of carbon per hectare per year, and for example, and these are passed down from on high from like the likes of the UN and EU. But if you actually go out and measure on the ground, you can use tier 2 emissions, which are more let's say country specific, so that they can be more rigorous and they can give a more real idea of how much emissions are coming off a particular land cover type in a particular country. But these are usually point samples as well. So a map such as the ones on the right, which is where we take the Tellus peatland map, the one I made, and combine it with something like a land cover map, for example, Corrine, we can then mix them together. So we end up with a peat on forestry, peat grass, peat on peat, for example, and then start to come up with some more locally significant emission factors, and then start to really sort of define down how much emissions are coming from a certain area. So maps like this can be very important for emission estimations. And you can see here that if you use tier 1 emissions, possibly you'd be overestimating the amount of carbon that comes from a site like this. Again, this is not rigorous. It's just something I put together very quickly for talks like this, but it's just an idea of what can be done. So the next step, and what I did straight away after my PhD, was to try and develop this method a little bit, again, with the objectivity in mind, where I keep my hands off it if possible. So the plan was to make an entire national map, which is what I showed at the start, using the Tellus data wherever it was available. So I said earlier that the machine learning, it puts out a 1 or a 0, a peat or a non-peat sort of answer, but it's actually a little bit more clever than that. It gives you 2 answers, but it says how likely each one is to be right. And effectively, that's what we see here. So for the whole country, I've been able to run this schematic where we take the DEM, which is the elevation, the slope, and then the radiometric data, and put it through a trained neural network. And then it's able to say with the confidence if a reading or if a measurement comes from a peat soil or a non-peat soil. And just as an example, it has to equal 1. It's like a probability. So 85% likely to be peat, 15% likely to be non-peat. And then you can classify it down to peat or non-peat, and then again classify it into a high confidence or a low confidence. And that's effectively what I've done for the whole country of Ireland, wherever that data exists, and breaking it down into a more rigorous sort of 4-class system instead of just a simple 2-class system. And this is to identify transition zones where we move from peat to non-peat soils. So, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second, but just bringing it back to the point of the 4 or 3 points to convey was that all maps, instead of all maps being wrong, I suppose the right thing to say is all maps have some sort of resolution that needs to be understood and known before they're used for any sort of decisions. Hopefully you can sort of understand the data though into creating this particular map, and then how the map is validated. That's the sort of the last step, and it's something that's very important as well, because a map is only as good as how well it's validated. So earlier I mentioned that we did have a geochemical soil survey across Ireland. The white dots in the middle are all of those data points and where they've been released to the public so far. There's almost 8,500 or just over 8,500 data points across that part of the country already. And they record lots of different geochemical signatures, but the one that we were interested in was something called loss on ignition, which measures the percentage of organic matter. So they take the sample and they burn it basically, and how much material is left after it's burnt is the loss on ignition, and then you can work out how much organic matter was in the soil sample. So if we take that map again now, and we take all of those validation points across where they are available, we can see the 4 classes up here. This is the Tellus classification. So non-peat, high confidence, non-peat, low confidence, and then peat, low confidence, peat, high confidence, based on the machine learning. We can then see how many of those loss and ignition data points fall in each of those classifications and their average values. So the loss and ignition samples are taken from a shallow reading at 20 centimeters, a deep reading at 50, and then I just average them to get sort of the average reading, because radiometrics is a bulk reading, is a bulk measurement. And so I was able to then show, that basically the non-peat high confidence has a very low, all the loss and ignition samples within that classification are very low in organic content. And it sort of moves up through the ranges then until we get to peat high confidence. So in that way, we're able to translate these classifications into something more meaningful to a soil scientist, for example, whereby we have a low to high with some sort of middle ground SOC estimations from this data. So that's the three sort of points of mapping, really. It's like all maps have a resolution, in my mind anyway. You need to understand the data that went into creating them, and then how the maps are validated is also very important. So moving on a little bit now onto different data techniques. So, this was called supervised learning, and everything we've shown here is called supervised machine learning, whereby we have to give it some information. We do have to know something about we have to know some answers before it'll actually work, right? So we had to pick points that we knew were peat and pick points we knew weren't peat in order to train the network. And that's one of the disadvantages. It's not a method that could be used in a fresh area, in a virgin area where you don't know where the peatlands are. It might only be indicative in places like that, but in areas where you have maps, this could be useful. But there are other methods for making maps of things, and one of them is called unsupervised machine learning. So unsupervised machine learning is where we try and break the data into different groups, and each group is related to each other, and each group can be represented by something called a center or a cluster center. So you can see this sort of big blue circle and the big red X and the big yellow cross, and that's just the cluster center. It's the one data point that represents that colored data, let's say. There's lots of different methods of clustering. That's what the method is called, clustering. And I'm just showing two of them here. One of them is k-means clustering, which is a more traditional method. It attempts to sort of minimize the distance, the end distance between each of those little dots and the big cluster center. Self-organizing maps is a neural network clustering technique. It's using high order, it uses statistical relationships between the data in order to place those green dots into the places, into the cluster centers effectively. Now it's a really powerful technique because, for me anyway, it removes the spatial element. So, we're looking at two axes here. This could be temperature and pressure, or it could be rainfall, and it could be anything you want. And it could be multiple, like this is just showing 2D data, but it can be multi-dimensional data as well. So it's really powerful technique for simplifying a complicated multi-dimensional data set where you have multiple layers, and simplifying it down to be something much more visually easy to follow and much more easy to analyze. One of the downfalls, though, of unsupervised learning is that, how do you pick the number of clusters to best represent the data? It's usually a subjective choice. And as I mentioned, I was trying to remove all subjectivity from my thesis where possible. So I'll talk a little bit about that now as well. So just to sort of highlight how clustering can be used on spatial data, this is just an example data set. This is something called the rice grain model. It's just a black and white or a grayscale image with rice on a shadowed background, so moving from a dark shadow on the bottom to a sort of a lighter shadow at the top. But it can be, easily represented or thought of like a map. So you have every pixel is an X and Y location in space, and every pixel has a value from 0 to, I think it's 256, 0 being black and 256 being pure white. So, that's your data. Your measurement is grayscale and your X and Y locations. To make it a bit easier to see, we can color these things in. So if a pixel has a value from 0 to 80, I've just colored it red, 81, and this to 120, it's cyan, for example. And this is just numbers I picked. These aren't rigorous. This is just something I picked for just to show visually how we might be able to segment this image or cluster this image and group it together into areas of similarity. So during my PhD, I came up with a method called MCAST. It's a stability metric. So when you cluster a data set, when you try and group a data set multiple times, if the cluster centers, those points are stable, if they're in the same place every time, then you get a nice low metric. And if they're not in the same place every time, you get a high metric. Now that's complicated and maybe a bit strange sounding, but what it really means is that when you run the clustering multiple times, you can see changes in where the boundaries are, for example. So it's not, it's not a bad result. You might even look at it if it was a single run and say that looks okay. But over multiple runs, you can't trust that it'll give you the same answer every time. And so If you only run it 4 times and run it multiple times, you can see it's a very stable answer. So that's basically what the graph is showing. And the metric that we came up with during my PhD was called this MCAST. It's a stability metric for spatial data, just to show that it is a good clustering result and you can trust the answer. Bringing it back to the peatlands very quickly, because I realize it's already 40 minutes somehow. The research question then that we asked for the second sort of part of all this was, can machine learning be used to create a framework for monitoring peatland restoration? And then can we include the radiometric data in this as well and sort of build a top-down sort of surface, subsurface view of a complicated area in a relatively simple way of viewing it? So just to, satellite data, we touched on it briefly before. It's basically 13 different bands of electromagnetic energy from the near infrared, visible, and ultraviolet. And the goal was to try and break that data down over 2 years of satellite data, break it down into and see if we can monitor change on the site. So it was the same site that I studied, that I showed in the earlier slides. So the top graphs are just showing which cluster numbers were the right numbers to use. So in the 2017 data, it was 4 clusters was the right answer. And in 2018, 3 clusters were the right answer. The bottom is just showing the spatial distribution of those clusters across the site. So you can see that, for example, cluster 1 is around the edges and cluster 4 is more to the middle, and 1 around the edges and 3 in the 2018 data. And this top graph here, I haven't shown before, but it's basically, it's the fingerprint. It's the cluster center result for the 4 cluster answer and for the 3 cluster answer. So these are the bands, the 13 bands across the bottom. And this is the amplitude, or the data that best represents the color below. The only really important thing to remember here is that this range here is vegetation, and at the end here, this is basically soil moisture, for anyone who's not familiar with satellite data. So high vegetation shows a high value, and low vegetation is a low value on both sides. And we can compare these two. So the 2018 data is dashed and 2017 data is solid. And so basically what's happening is you can see that there's a slight dip in the vegetation from 2017 to 2018. This sort of yellowy layer, which is this color up here, sort of seems to merge into the brown layer, and that's why we end up with all brown in the middle, and you get a lowering of the vegetation overall and an increase in this red edge. And so this is in 2018 there was a big drought in Ireland basically, and red edge is sensitive to vegetation stress. So an increase in this red edge value is indicative of vegetation stress, and of course there was an overall lowering of vegetation abundance generally. That's what we're seeing here, with that, and soil moisture staying pretty much the same in the near surface. So basically, the outcome of all of this was an objective tool. Like, there was very little human input to this. This was a data-driven metric that came up with a way of monitoring this peatland over time. And the final question was, can we integrate the radiometric data? Because of course radiometric data is looking below the surface, whereas satellites are looking on the surface. So could we integrate the radiometric data in this clustering framework to look at the peatland, not only from the surface, but at the subsurface as well, and sort of divide it into maybe management zones, for example. And, using the exact same analysis, we found that 3 clusters was the best answer. And again, we had high vegetation linked with a higher radiometric signal. And high radiometric signal means less attenuation, and less attenuation means either thin peat or mixing of peat and mineral soils. So basically trees, etc., are growing on this sort of mixture of peaty soils. And in the main part of the bog, the main part of the peatland, where there's very little vegetation, we have very low radiometric signal, indicative of good quality. There's still peat present, basically. So future research, and what I'm doing now, is taking these techniques and trying to apply them to drone-based surveys, where we're looking at individual fields and farms. I said I was working for Teagasc, which is our agricultural agency. And so they're interested in helping farmers meet some of the targets that's been pressed on them from the EU and from the nature restoration laws. So if you're going to re-wet your farm site, what sort of agriculture can still be done in it, for example. And my role within the project is to map the extent of peat on these farms, and also look at monitoring the water table change over time. The idea being that if we do repeat radiometric surveys to go the experiment, and instead of just experiments of one, we're doing multiple experiments in time, and can the change in signal over time be related to water table depth, and then that be used to sort of classify a site into being successfully re-wet or not. So this is a sort of continuation of the work that I'm doing. That's sort of it for the study, for the talk, I suppose. It flew by from my side. I hope it was understandable. But just if anyone is interested, we have lots of projects going on in Ireland at the moment. If you're thinking post-masters, keep Ireland in mind. And otherwise, that's my contact details. If anyone has any questions, either on Twitter or X, or via email, or even here, I'm ready to answer. Thank you.